Well, hello everyone, and welcome again to another Lean In session. As always, I'm Michael Linke here at the Australian Institute of Architects in Melbourne, and it's great to have you with me yet again. In today's session, Philippa Stone and Laura Guccione from BlueScope, the Institute's principal corporate partner, are joining us, and today they're discussing their commitment to environmental responsibility through EPDs, or Environmental Product Declarations. EPDs are a very transparent and credible way of communicating the life cycle environmental impacts of a product. And as EPDs allow specifiers to make more informed decisions about material selection from an environmental perspective, they're very popular also for construction-based products and also for the use of products with EPDs now being recognised and rewarded in rating schemes such as Green Star and IS. Philippa and Laura from BlueScope will explain the key features of an EPD as well as how they work in their application, and also using BlueScope's COLORBOND steel EPD as an example. Many of you will have questions for today, so don't forget, as always, the chat box is your friend. So if you do have any questions for Laura and Pip, then please, by all means, pop a question into the chat box, and then I'll go through them with the ladies at the end of the session. A little bit about our two speakers. Philippa Stone, or as we like to call her, Pip Stone, is the Sustainability Manager at BlueScope Steel, and she has responsibility for sustainable strategies, including the sustainability credentials of BlueScope's Australian products. Prior to her joining BlueScope, Pip led the sustainability strategy of global construction specialist ISG, and she was based in London for around 12 years. Laura Guccione is also on the call, and it's great to have her with us. And Laura is a senior technical advisor at BlueScope Steel. And Laura focuses very much on the development and the maintenance of technical sustainability credentials, such as EPDs for BlueScope's Australian suite of products and solutions. Prior to BlueScope, Laura worked as a sustainability consultant for South Pole in Sydney and also for the UN Environment Programme in Paris. And Pip and Laura joined me both on today's Lean In. Ladies, great to have you with me on our Lean In session today. Thanks very much for joining us. How are you both?
Very well, thank you for having us.
Very good, thank you very much.
Absolute pleasure to have you both, and welcome, of course, to BlueScope, the Institute's principal corporate partner on this really interesting subject today. So I'll hand it over to you both and spend the next few moments telling us a little bit about EPDs in greater detail.
Thank you very much. Hi everyone and welcome. My name is Pip and I am Sustainability Manager at BlueScope. And with me is Laura, who's our Senior Technical Advisor and our Product Eco-Labelling Specialist. So we've got roughly half an hour today and we're going to talk you through the kind of broader responsible product space, and that will include an introduction to Environmental Product Declarations, or EPDs. So I thought I would kind of set the scene for us with the drivers for responsible products and what you should be looking for when you're specifying. And then Laura is going to walk you through an example of an EPD, talk you through how they're applied and highlight their limitations, and then we'll finish off with the Q&A with all your burning questions. So for anyone who isn't familiar with BlueScope, we are Australia's largest manufacturer and we specialise in flat steel products. You may know us better from some of these brands. Our products are used both in residential and commercial applications as well as in infrastructure. And you're probably most familiar with COLORBOND steel, and it's the EPD for COLORBOND that we're going to hone in on later in this session. So, as I said, we'll start with setting the scene as to why responsible products are an important issue and a highly topical one. And I wanted to briefly touch on the global megatrends. You may have heard of them. They're the gradual but powerful trends that have the potential to impact the way we all live and work over time. In this session, we're interested in the trends relating to sustainability, but I wanted to highlight that they cover wider issues such as a growing and aging population, rapid technology change, and an increased focus on human health. But if we start with the image in the top left-hand corner, which is from the 2020 Global Risks Report by the World Economic Forum. And this is the group that we hear about every year from their conference in Davos. Every year they publish a Global Risks Report, and this year was significant because for the first time, the top 5 risks by likelihood identified by survey respondents, and these are respondents from business, government, civil society, and thought leaders. The top 5 risks were all environmental, and they're the 5 green diamonds you can see in the first column. And then the top risk in terms of impact, and that's the second column there, is climate action failure. It's worth bearing in mind, of course, that this report was pre-COVID-19, and that number 10 on the list in terms of impact is infectious diseases. So given our current situation, we may see a bit of a shuffle in the rankings in next year's report. And then in the top right corner, the colourful wheel is the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which I imagine many of you would be familiar with. And these are the goals for 2030 agreed upon by UN member states, and they include issues such as climate action, responsible production and consumption, and decent work and economic growth. And you can see how these themes echo those in the Global Risks Report. And then finally down the bottom, we have the key impact areas identified for the built environment as set out by the World Green Building Council: climate action, resource efficiency, and health and well-being. Again, pretty consistent with what's happening in the broader sustainability context. So how does our industry respond to all of this? Well, in Australia, we have green building rating schemes like Green Star that are really picking up on these themes and using them to create a framework for more sustainable buildings. And where do manufacturers fit in all this? So on this slide, I've outlined 4 key ways that manufacturers can contribute to more sustainable outcomes. And the first is by minimising their environmental impact. And this goes hand in hand with efficiency for many issues. And there's a strong business case for continuous improvement in this regard. Generally speaking, where there are efficiencies to be made, there is money to be saved. And then we have transparency, a word which you've already heard and you'll hear a lot during this session. Transparency is critical in order to facilitate responsible decision making, and that's both internally within a manufacturer's operations, but also externally, so that specifiers such as yourselves can make informed decisions based on credible information. And when we talk about transparency, I think it's key to highlight social as well as environmental transparency. Fantastic if a manufacturer has an EPD or an eco-label highlighting their environmental impact or their credentials. But what about the supply chain involved in its manufacture? Who made it? What conditions were they employed under? Were they even employed? Manufacturers obviously have a really big responsibility in this space also, and you might have to dig a bit harder to find this information, perhaps into procurement policies if they have any. If you're interested in what BlueScope is doing, then you can find the information on our website and in our annual sustainability report. And that ties in nicely with stewardship, which is scrutiny of the supply chain, both in terms of environmental and social impact. Product stewardship is also a really great way for a manufacturer to manage risk in their supply chain. If we map out our supply chain and identify key risk areas, we can better manage the risk to our business and to our customers. And then lastly, as manufacturers, we need to offer products that both meet the needs of the market and perhaps more importantly, anticipate the needs of the market so that when that switch is turned, we are ready with a solution. So at the moment, we're seeing an increased demand for responsible products in the market. So staying abreast of megatrends and anticipating their impact on regulation and the market is therefore critical for us. So a quick pause here to reflect on the importance of transparency as we move into the more technical section of the presentation. There are a lot of businesses out there making a lot of claims about their products. How can you, as specifiers, weed out the misleading information and make more informed decisions? Well, not by looking at how much of the colour green they've used in their marketing collateral. So what is out there to help you? So on this next slide, I've put up some of the key eco-labelling tools in the market that are common for building products. And they fall into 3 main groups, which are defined by an ISO standard. The first grouping up there is stewardship schemes. And these schemes are usually industry driven, and they tend to focus on issues that are specific for that particular industry or product. Most of you would be familiar with FSC, which is hopefully pretty standard for your timber specifications, but you may be less familiar with responsible steel, which was launched in December last year. BlueScope's a founding member of Responsible Steel, which is the first global standard and certification initiative for the steel industry, which supports responsible sourcing and production of steel. It covers a really wide range of areas, from human and labour rights to climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And by specifying a stewardship scheme like Responsible Steel, you are supporting steel manufacturers who source and manufacture steel to high social and environmental standards. It's worth highlighting at this point, before you get too excited, that as it's a new standard, most steel manufacturers are in the process of becoming certified. So it might be hard to get responsible steel at this point in time, but watch this space because hopefully it won't be too much longer. The second grouping identified on this slide is the ISO Type 1 labels, which are often referred to as eco-labels. And eco-labels focus on identifying the overall environmental preference of a product within a product category. And they do this by highlighting products that are better than the average in terms of environmental performance. They take into account various criteria and lifecycle considerations, which may include the impact of raw materials, manufacturing, performance during the use phase, and recycling or disposal. And eco-labels are awarded by an impartial third party, such as Green Tag or Gecko, who I've put up here, to products that meet the specified criteria. So an eco-label allows you as a specifier to choose a product that is deemed environmentally superior in some way in accordance with their specified set of criteria. And then finally up there we have EPDs, which are classified as Type 3 environmental labels under the ISO standard. And that's what we'll focus on for the rest of this session. For the eagle-eyed amongst you, you'll note that Type 2 eco-labels aren't on this slide. And for those who are interested, Type 2 is for self-declared claims. So that's claims for a manufacturer about a single attribute of a product, such as whether it's compostable, recyclable, recycled content, or similar. Okay, so if we move on to EPDs, as I said, EPDs are a transparent way to communicate information about the environmental performance of a product. Unlike eco-labels like Gecko and Green Tag, EPDs do not make any claims or comparisons between products. Rather, they provide complete and fully transparent information on the properties and environmental impact of the material based on life cycle information. And this allows the user to make their own comparison between products. And this is particularly important for construction materials, as their influence on the environment depends on many factors, and they only develop their full environmental characteristics and properties once they are part of a building. It's worth noting that EPDs aren't exclusive to building products. If you look on the EPD Australasia website, where all Australian and New Zealand EPDs are registered, you can see EPDs for wool products and even for tissues. But of the 64 EPDs currently registered, 57 relate to the building industry. So you can see where the market demand for EPDs currently is. So if we move on to understanding EPD information, EPDs need to meet various standards in order to be compliant. And these standards are aimed at ensuring the information being published is reliable and easy to understand. In order to be able to publish our EPDs, we need to ensure that both the EPD and the life cycle assessment study that supports it are done in compliance with ISO standards, have been independently reviewed by a third party, that all the information presented is transparent and credible, that the results presented are for the full data set, so nothing is being hidden, that the information presented is simple, or at least as simple as this type of technical information can be. And you'll see what I mean when Laura walks you through the COLORBOND EPD, because it does get very technical. Perhaps most importantly, that it's understandable and useful to the consumer. So you can see on this slide the 4 EPDs that BlueScope currently has. These cover hot rolled coil, welded beams and columns, exceller plate steel, and COLORBOND steel. Now, our hot rolled coil EPD, which is the material from which we make COLORBOND in many of our products, it was published 5 years ago, and it was the first Australian EPD under the Australasian EPD program. EPDs last for 5 years, so that EPD is actually up for renewal this year, and that means that Laura and I are working very hard behind the scenes to get all our life cycle information updated so that they can be republished imminently. And this process means we can identify where we've made efficiencies in our operations over the years and where there's further room for improvement. It's worth noting how resource intensive this process is. Laura has been working on the EPD updates pretty much full time for about 6 months. She hasn't done it in isolation. We've engaged many people from our operations to get the supporting data that the lifecycle assessment requires. And we also have a consultant on board, excuse me, who's doing all the modelling for us. And that data will then go on to a third party who will verify the data and our model. So it's no small undertaking, and that's just for the update of the EPD. For a company who's embarking on this for the first time, it's probably more like a year, depending on how readily available the data is and how complex the model is. So with that in mind, I'm going to pass you over to our expert, Laura, who's going to give you a guided tour of the COLORBOND EPD.
Okay, well, thanks, Pip. So now it is my turn to give you a tour of BlueScope's COLORBOND EPD. In this introduction to our EPD, I will be highlighting the key information that you should be looking out for, as well as any considerations that you should keep in mind when comparing EPDs of different products. So to start, the first thing that you will see in a COLORBOND EPD, or in the COLORBOND EPD, is the key insights page. This page provides a snapshot of some of the key content within the EPD, such as the product that is being covered, information on EPD compliance, information about the recycled content in the product, as well as the composition of the product. In this case, the EPD presents the environmental impact results for COLORBOND of 2 thicknesses, 0.42 and 0.48 millimeters, which are mainly used for roofing applications. So I'm now going to zoom in into this particular page. So as part of the EPD compliance information, what you can expect to see first is the name of the standard that we have followed for the assessment, a confirmation that our EPD has been independently verified. So Pete mentioned the third-party verification. That's exactly what this is talking about. And also an indication of the scope of the assessment. And when we're talking about the scope, what we really mean is the life cycle stages and the processes that have been considered in the assessment. And we are going to be looking a bit closer into this in the next slide. In the next pages in our EPD, you can also expect to see the case studies showing information about how the product is being used in actual buildings, further EPD compliance information, as well as some additional general product information, such as details on the product composition, a reach statement, which also can provide you information on whether any hazardous substances have been used or whether they're absent in the product, and also some useful links on where you can find product safety data sheets. In an EPD, you can also expect to see a detailed overview of the product lifecycle. So this means the raw materials that we have used, the transport of these raw materials to the manufacturing site, the manufacturing operations themselves, the use of the product, as well as the recycling or the disposal of the product at its end of life. To zoom in a little bit onto these processes, in the case of COLORBOND steel, we have put an emphasis on the different stages of the manufacturing process. This involved all the processes that we actually have direct control over, including the steel making. So this is the transformation of the raw materials into the molten steel and then into slabs. Next, we have the milling and the cold reduction processes, where this is where the slab gets transformed into coils, which then gets sent on to the metal coating and the paint lines. As you can see in the map in the figure, we have also indicated where in Australia these processes are being carried out. Next in our EPD, we have the scope declaration, which is where we're going to indicate which stages of the product life cycle we have actually included in our assessment. So first we have just mentioned all of them, all the life cycle stages. Now we're focusing on the ones that we are actually assessing in our EPD. These life cycle stages are divided in modules. You can see these letters in the third row in the table. So those are the modules. For most EPDs, it's mandatory that you include the modules A1 to A3, which are the ones that involve the impacts from the raw materials, the transport of those raw materials to the manufacturing and the manufacturing process itself. Alternatively, the manufacturer can actually choose to include other stages, such as the construction, which is represented by modules A4 and A5, the use phase, which is the module B, the end of life or the disposal of the product, module C, and also we have an additional one, which is separated, is the recovery of recycling of the product, which is represented by module D. In the case of the COLORBOND EPD, we have included the modules A1 to A3, which are the mandatory ones. And this is because, well, these are the ones that we have complete control over, and we have all the information that is necessary to do a thorough assessment of our operations. Additionally, we have included the impacts from the waste processing and the disposal of the steel, which are the modules C3 and C4, as well as the module D, which represents the recycling. All these stages are really quite significant in terms of the impact that they can have over the overall life cycle of the steel. So it's important that we include them. In this EPD, the construction and the use phase stages were actually not included, as they can be quite dependent on the specific application of the product. Nonetheless, all of them should be taken into account when you're looking to assess the whole of life of a particular building or structure. These kind of assessments are usually done with the support of a sustainability professional, just the same as we need some support for our EPDs. And usually you will need somebody that has a good knowledge of life cycle and assessment methodologies to help you with this process. So next in our EPD, we have the money table, which actually is a table that presents the main results of our life cycle assessment, or LCA. As you can see in this table, we have indicated the products that are being assessed and their declared unit, which in this case is 1 square meter of COLORBOND of either the 0.42 or 0.48 millimeters. So that's on the top row in the table. When we look at any EPD, it is important that we pay attention to the declared unit, which is the unit that is often chosen based on the functionality of the product. In this case, the COLORBOND steel thicknesses that we're using are the ones that are commonly used for roofing applications. So in this case, it makes sense to use a unit of 1 square meter, which is the area that we can expect to be covered by the product. And just to note, this is actually in flat form. So this is as it leaves BlueScope's factory prior to the roll forming process, which is the final product. It is possible that other products, let's say an alternative roofing material, might use a different metric, such as kilograms, to present the results. So it is really important that we pay attention to these units if we want to make a comparison between products. Now, in the right column on the table, you will, in the left column of the table, you'll find environmental impact indicators with the units of measure. For example, we have the global warming potential, which is represented by the kilograms of CO2 equivalent per square meter of COLORBOND steel. Another example, on the third row, we have the acidification potential of land and water, which is represented by the kilograms of sulfur dioxide equivalent. For example, this particular impact is associated with emission of acids into the atmosphere, which are then deposited into the soil and water. So all of these impacts reflect different environmental impacts on the actual environment, or actually potential environmental impacts. So right next to them, we have the numbers that you see on the table, which are actually our results. And these impacts are not only subdivided by product, but also by the module or the lifecycle stage. So this can actually allow you to see the relative impacts of each of the different lifecycle stages of a product. One thing you might notice is that some of these numbers have been written in scientific notation. And this is because some of them are actually quite small. And this is a good way of just simplifying how these numbers are being presented. In addition to this table, you will find similar others in our EPD. So there is more impact indicators that are disclosed, such as the use of renewable and non-renewable resources, waste, and also the material recovery. So when you have a chance to have a look at our overall BlueScope EPD, you will find all these additional indicators. So next in our EPDs, you can also expect to find the full details of the LCA methodology that we have used for the assessment, including any limitation it actually may have. You also find additional product information, such as durability and resilience, as well as corporate information, in this case, details of BlueScope's HSC and community performance. We are also well aware that not everyone is familiar with the LCA terminology. So we have also included a handy glossary of terms explaining them, which I hope you find them helpful. And finally, we have also included credibility information, which is actually stating all the standards and all the guidance that we have followed for the development of our EPDs. So I'm gonna zoom in into that. As you can see, this page shows the details of the EPD program that we're following, in this case, EPD Australasia, all the standards that we have used, as well as the details of the external third-party verifier who has reviewed and approved both our LCA and the content of this declaration. So now, how does a professional such as yourselves can compare products using the EPDs? Well, there are a couple of key questions that you should keep present when using EPDs to support your product selection. The first one is, what is the basis for comparison? So first, something that I have already mentioned, which units are we comparing? And the second, which impacts actually matter to you, your customers and the users of the building? As you have already seen, the results of an EPD cover a wide range of environmental impacts, such as the embodied energy, emissions to air, desertification, resource depletion, etc. But they also can provide information about other characteristics of a product that you may consider important. For example, the health and safety practices of the manufacturer, its management of social impacts, and maybe even its contribution to the local economy. This is why my recommendation is that you look at EPDs the same way that you will look at a nutritional label. When you're shopping in the supermarket, very often that you'll find that products that you're comparing are not performing the best in all the nutritional categories, but you may choose to focus your attention in those particular categories that you consider important. Perhaps it could be the sodium content or the saturated fat content, let's say. The same approach can actually be applied to EPDs. So you can actually try to focus your attention on the impacts that you and your stakeholders will consider particularly important, which, for example, could include global environmental impacts such as climate change, as well as other that are more local. So what else you should keep in mind when comparing EPDs? Another important tip is to ensure that you're comparing apples with apples. So this means that we make sure that we're comparing, that the EPDs that you're looking at, follow the same rules and the same methods. And this is why we have this little disclaimer in our EPDs as a reminder of this. The EPD standards get outdated every so often, and it's possible that you'll find EPDs that are using different standards. So it's always good to keep this in mind and look at for this just to make sure that you're making the right comparisons. Another important thing is that we take into account the declared unit, as well as the context of the application. So we have a little example here. Let's assume that an alternative roofing material, such as terracotta tiles, have presented the EPD results based on mass. So they don't have it per square meter, but on mass. In that case, if you actually would like to make a meaningful comparison between the tiles and the COLORBOND steel roofing, you actually will have to determine what's the weight of the tiles that will be used to cover 1 square meter of the roof. So in this example, we're assuming that the mass of the terracotta tiles is 10 times that of the steel roofing per square meter, meaning that any impacts that you will find in the EPD of the terracotta tiles will have to be multiplied by 10 to get the steel equivalent. This way you actually will have a proper comparison. So this is something else that you should keep in mind. So now that you know the basics about the EPDs and how to compare them, let's look at the ways that they can actually help you achieve points under some of the green building certification schemes. First, let's have a look at Green Star, which is a certification scheme developed by the GBCA. As I had mentioned earlier, BlueScope EPDs can assist in obtaining points under Lifecycle Impacts credit when you do an LCA of a whole building. But what I had not mentioned before is that there are also additional points that can be scored under this same credit when you focus on the optimization of the steel that is being used for the framing or the reinforcement of the structure. So overall, EPDs can be particularly handy for this credit, as well as the Sustainable Products credit, which is actually the one that awards points for using products that have EPDs or any other sustainability credentials, for example, eco-labels. There are another couple of credits that are not directly linked to the use of EPDs, but are worth mentioning, such as the Responsible Building Materials credit, which grants points for the use of steel from responsible steel makers. And there are actually some requirements that need to be met by the manufacturer to be considered as a responsible steel maker. And there's also the Heat Island Effect credit, which is particularly important for roofing materials. In this case, what the credit requires is a minimum solar reflectance index, which is usually associated with the use of lighter shades in roofs. So there are actually several colors of COLORBOND steel that comply with this particular requirement. One important thing to note is that these EPDs, these credits correspond to the current version of Green Star, which is currently under review. So this might actually change later this year. Another certification that is worth mentioning is the IS rating from the Infrastructure Sustainability Council of Australia. Under the IS rating, points are granted for the use of products with sustainability labels. So that includes products that have EPDs. And also for products that can demonstrate an easy deconstruction, disassembly, and also products that enable resource recovery. So these last two credits are not directly linked to the EPD, but they're also relevant for various steel products. So overall, the aim of an EPD is to give you transparent information and confidence in the assessment of impacts. And this is one of the reasons why that products with EPD actually get rewarded points under these schemes. Now to sum up our presentation, I'll hand it over to Pip.
Thank you, Laura. So just to really reiterate on this slide that the sweet spot for the use of EPDs is in the context of a building or structure. And that is when you can take into account the performance of the product and the impact that it can have in influencing the performance of the building when it's in use, its needs for maintenance and longevity. In a whole of life cycle assessment, EPDs can be used to represent the impacts of products as they are used in the building and to optimize the design of the building to lower the overall environmental impact. And this can be done through a hotspot analysis, which allows the designer to focus on the big ticket items and use the product to their best advantage. So it's not saying that you can't look at EPDs in isolation and try and make a comparison. You can, but we would urge caution, and that's not really the intended use of an EPD. The best use of it is in the context of the building. And I imagine we might discuss that more in the Q&A. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. We've put a few links up here for further information. You can find EPDs in a number of places. They will usually be on a company's website, but you can also go direct to EPD Australasia, where all registered EPDs are hosted, or on the International EPD website, which is also up there. And then, as a bit of an aside, but something you might find useful, we've put up a link to the BPI database, which you may not be familiar with because it is new-ish. But essentially it's a database that allows you to filter by sustainability credentials of the product, not just whether it has an EPD, but broader issues like resilience, particularly relevant for extreme weather and bushfire. And it also assesses a company's overall approach to sustainability, which encompasses some of those broader issues I touched on earlier in the presentation. So if you haven't come across it, it's worth checking out. And Michael, will hand back to you for Q&A.
Thank you very much. Laura and Pip from BlueScope Steel, great to have that time with you to take us through some of the EPD questions have come through thick and fast, both privately and on the group chat. In terms of validity, let's start with this one for both of you. And interesting question, validity of EPDs, how long do they last for and how often do they have to be reviewed?
5 years. So you can do it more regularly if you'd like. But as I said, it's quite an undertaking. So I'd suggest people are less likely to do it more often than that. But yeah, every 5 years. And you can check, all EPDs will have their expiration date on in there somewhere. So yeah.
And in terms of the verifiers, I mean, how are they kept in check?
Laura, do you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, sure. So the verifiers are actually approved experts by EPD Australasia. So they're usually members of the Australian Lifecycle Assessment Society or other experts that have actually credentials on lifecycle assessment and their experience with EPDs, and they can actually do the verification process.
Okay, great stuff. Another question, this is one from me. In terms of consumer behavior, we see now people are very interested to see where their products are coming from. You know, a few years ago, it was all about conflict diamonds and people wanted to know where their jewellery was sourced from. And now we've seen, and I'm glad you brought it up, the comments in relation to food health rating labels so people can assess the health of the products that they're buying. We see this very much as an emerging sort of key thing now in many products. Do you see EPDs now going forward really being the way that consumers stipulate that architects specify product? Do you see this as a growing trend?
In the building industry, definitely. In terms of, you know, goes back to those key words of transparency and credibility. They are the key tool for manufacturers to convey what goes into those materials. So yes. Okay. And so you will see the likes of Green Star and IS Rating continuing to champion not just EPDs now, but going the next step into eco labels also. But yeah, they're not going anywhere and they're only going to grow.
Okay. A question from Rebecca on the chat. She says, look, who verifies compliance to international standards for their EPDs?
So that will be the EPD verifier. So first we have access to the standards. So when we are actually developing the EPD and the lifecycle assessment that backs it, we have to keep in mind all of these rules. And then we also have to make sure that the information we're presenting in the EPD is conforming to these standards. This is then checked by this external third-party verifier.
Okay. A question from Timothy on the chat, and he says, look, is there any comparison between timber cladding and steel cladding in the environmental performance?
If you can find an EPD for that timber cladding, then you can certainly make a comparison. It depends on what issues you're interested in. So if we go back to Laura's point about how you compare, so you just need to make sure that the same unit's being used, and depends which categories you want to compare against. So you may be interested in acidification, you may be interested in ozone depletion. So pick your category, and if you can find the number for COLORBOND and you can find the number for the timber. Again, I would say you want to be making that comparison in the context of the building. You need to be thinking about maintenance. How is that product used? What's going to happen at end of life? How's it going to be disposed of? Is it going to be recycled? Is it going to go to landfill? All those kind of considerations. So you can definitely make the comparison, but you may want to consult an expert to help you make that comparison.
Of course. Look, another question that's come through from Jonathan on the chat, and he talks about the preparation and application of the coatings. You know, you're talking about raw steel, and of course that's your remit as BlueScope, and that's obviously what you're well recognised for. But in terms of the subsequent layering of product on top of raw product, I mean, you're talking about powder coating, whatever it might be, those subsequent recycling processes that go onto the raw product. How does the preparation or the EPD get affected by the subsequent layers of product on top of the raw?
Yeah, it certainly does. And if you look at the COLORBOND EPD, it's all in there. It's in there up until our factory gate. So if we go back to Laura's explanation, you might remember the diagram of all the life cycle stages. So the coating and painting stages are certainly in there. When it leaves our factory gate at Port Kembla, it's in a coil form. And that's where the kind of assessment ends. It then moves on. The one impact that isn't currently included, that we're looking to include in the next update, is the roll forming. So obviously when you apply COLORBOND to a roof, it's got a profile to it, and that's done outside of our factory gate. So that is a process that isn't currently included, that we're looking to include. But having said all of that, obviously the big impact for steel making is in the steel making rather than the coating and painting. So once that's added, you'll find it may have a very, very negligible impact on the overall indicators.
True. This is an interesting question, and I suppose I would like both of your perception on industry's commitment to sustainable product generally. I mean, without naming names, is there a sense of how well Australian companies are adapting products and utilising EPDs in a meaningful way, or do you feel that maybe companies are going through the motions to keep customers happy and satisfy consumer demand?
Yeah, it is a great question. I would say that we're seeing a shift at the moment. I mean, perhaps more difficult for me to comment because I've been in the UK for 12 years and it's a bit of a different space there maybe, but the impression I get, certainly within BlueScope, that the inquiries are coming now in thick and fast, even in the last 6 to 12 months. So I think we will see more companies taking action in this space, and certainly I speak to developers quite regularly, not just about EPDs, but about responsible products more generally. Pretty common discussion.
Yep, sounds good. Now, if people have other questions for you and they want to reach out to you privately to ask other questions, one of the things is, can we speak to Laura and Pip privately on a couple of matters? Your email addresses are on the screen, I presume. Yep, perfect. Just reach out and get in touch.
We'd love to hear from you.
No, that's great. Absolutely. That sounds wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So what we'll do, we'll leave the questions there if that's all right. Thank you so much again, Philippa Stone or Pip Stone and Laura Guccione from BlueScope Steel, the Institute Principal Corporate Partner, for joining us today. It's been fantastic to have you on this session. Very educational. This week we're all about sustainability, I will say that. So on Thursday, what we are going to do is be joined by BEC, Built Environment Channel, and another one of our corporate partners here at the Institute. And we're talking about business for social good, and that's being presented by Andrew Stefano and Robert Goodliff. And that's talking about how the challenges that are facing today's society are inspiring businesses, and especially architects, to seek benefits, I suppose, for the greater good. So architects are really broadening goals from simply profit to more holistic results, including obviously environmental concerns, and we've touched on that today. And so architects are now being asked to design much more than ever before for a much more sustainable future. And so businesses are now considering the impacts of their operations beyond the work that they produce. So to discuss this challenge, as I said, we've got Robert Goodliffe from Clark Hopkins Clark. He's going to be providing insight into certification as a B Corporation. And joining him is the Chief Executive of Built Environment Channel, Andrew Stefano, and he's going to be describing their efforts to support the architecture and built environment professions. So do join us on Thursday for that lean-in. That is it for today. My pleasure, as always, to spend this time with you. I'm Michael Linke here at the Institute of Architects. I've been your host today, and look forward to seeing you again online at our next lean-in on Thursday. Thank you once again to BlueScope. Great to have you with us, and look forward to seeing you at another lean-in very soon.